Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness. My name is Phil, and I'm here with my co-host Dan and a good friend of Dan's who I've met a couple of times while he was here in the UK. Bruce Blackshaw will be talking about some of the issues around pro-life, how Christians respond to pro-life, what pro-life means, but specifically looking at issues that Christians may not have thought about before, such as artificial wombs. And if you're like me and not medically trained or have any medical background, you might be learning something new. So I'm going to be asking the basic questions. Dan's got more of a medical background than I do, so he's also published with Bruce. Bruce is also a very clever guy. Just look at the description and you'll see what I mean. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring us all onto the screen. Bruce, welcome to Critical Witness. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Could we just say that you did a tremendous job, Phil, at not acting surprised?
I was working really hard at that.
I was about 7 out of 10, I would say.
7. I'm still improving on the I will not be surprised look.
I was just thinking quickly, Bruce. I remember we actually tried to start a pod. I think we had you and Robert Oram on, didn't we, to try and sort out a podcast about 18 months ago.
Yeah,
but it
I remember,
it went terribly bad. It went bad. It went bad. Not through fault of anyone.
No, I think it was the technology didn't quite play ball. We were using OBS software and Skype, and it was a mess. Yeah,
I do remember that being pretty complicated.
Yeah, so hopefully you were much more impressed with the intro video than you can see we've
come a long way.
We've
definitely done a lot of fine tuning.
Well, it's the wonders of StreamYard. It does it all for you, and you just turn up. It's a beautiful thing. So there you go. There is some unseen footage somewhere of us trying to get this to work. I'm sure it was deleted. So welcome, Bruce. Could you introduce yourselves a little bit, yourself to us, singular?
Sure.
Who are you? What do you do? And why are you a Christian in sort of a 5-minute summary?
Okay, I will try to do that.
Maybe 6 if we're generous.
Yeah, okay.
Even less because he'll go over.
Okay.
3.
So I'm kind of an Australian. I'm born in Australia now. But I have lived about 15 years of my life in the UK. I'm a dual citizen, both British and Australian. I grew up mainly in Australia with a bit of time in the US. My parents are both academics, mainly in the biological sciences. And we lived in the US a couple of times when I was a kid, which was the very first time I had any exposure to Christianity. I was packed off to a vacation Bible school when I was in probably 4th grade or something like that, because as you probably know, in the US, they have very long summer holidays, and my parents needed somewhere to send me for a week for a bit of peace, probably. And that was the first time I had been taught anything about the Bible, anything about God. My parents are agnostics. I'd never been to church or anything like that. So that was, I don't know, I think that was my first point of contact with Christianity, and just gave me possibly an interest in God and that kind of thing. I came back to Australia, and growing up as a teenager, got involved in a church youth group, kind of not by my design, really. I think my brother went along because of some encounter with a Christian group at school, and so I eventually got involved in that same group, joined the church, and eventually worked out what it was all about and became Christian. My parents still, my father's not alive anymore, but my mother is still an agnostic, and I've not really seen her change her beliefs at all in all that time, but she doesn't seem to have any problem with me being a Christian, as she's a fairly open-minded academic, so I guess that's not surprising. I write the odd Christian blog post on my blog, and she subscribes to it and reads it and talks about it, which is good. In terms of the rest of my life, I kind of have a few different interests, mainly sort of spending too much time at university studying. So I originally studied mathematics and physics. After a few years of teaching in high school, A-level maths and physics, I got a little tired of that and went back to university and did a computer science degree and started a career in software development. So I kind of still do that on the maybe half or 2/3 of my time. I moved to the UK, went in the late 90s and worked in investment banking for about 10 years on the IT side of things in the city, which was an interesting experience. And eventually went back to Australia, where I was married for all of that time to my wife Kim. We got married quite a long time ago in the mid-90s, and she came with me to the UK. Moved back to Australia. We've got 2 children who are now teenagers. While I was in the UK, I started an IT company, a software development company, which eventually I stopped work and dedicated myself to that full time. And I've been doing that for probably 18 years, maybe 15 years full time now. So I write encryption software during the day. The company is quite a small one. It's a fairly niche area. We're about 4 or 5 people in the company, spread around the world. I have a partner here in Brisbane. So I do that, but I work from home, and we've been doing it a long time, so I do have plenty of free time. So I've been involved in Christian apologetics for a long time and got a sort of always had an interest in philosophy. Realized that apologetics kind of needs philosophy to really understand what you're talking about. I really hate, making arguments to people and not actually realizing I'm completely out of my depth.
Happens all the time for me.
Well, yeah, it happens all the time for me as well, but slightly less since I decided I'd do a philosophy degree, and I kind of looked around and ended up doing one by distance from the University of London while I was in Australia. Around about 2014, I finally convinced my wife to let me move back to London. And so we moved back to London then. We'd been in Australia for a few years. And that's when I met Dan at the church I started going to in Wimbledon. And I was still doing my philosophy degree there. And after I finished that, after a couple of years in the UK. And since I normally end up studying something, I thought, well, what do I do with this philosophy degree? And what do you do after you do a degree? I guess you do a high degree, then you can learn even more about what you're studying, even if it is more specialized. And I think Dan was the one who convinced me to study bioethics and the ethics of abortion, which is what my PhD, which I'm still doing, is on. So I kind of, a friend in Australia who's a professor of biological engineering gave me a book on Christian biological ethics, bioethics, and I read that as well. And with Dan's prompting, I ended up applying for a PhD at the University of Birmingham in the ethics of abortion and got accepted. And since then, I've been working on that about half time. Hopefully we'll wrap that up in the next 12 months.
Dan has a habit of doing that, of pushing people into controversial topics.
I don't know what you mean.
he seems to have a way of convincing everyone else to do the controversial topics while he just does his operation department practice.
Yeah, I was pretty successful at that one. I was always interested in the ethics of abortion since I remember when I was a school teacher. I was teaching a Catholic school, and I remember publishing letters to the editor when people did those kind of things in the local newspaper here in Brisbane about an abortion case and things like that. So it didn't take too much to push me, but yeah, it's certainly a much more interesting area than what I was originally going to do, which I did a dissertation during my my philosophy degree on design, intelligent design, and I was thinking about continuing that on for a PhD, and I'm glad I didn't. It's a lot more interesting, the ethics of abortion. I think it's a lot more important.
And no one reads it either. It'd just be a waste of time. You'd write a big thesis, and about 7 people in the world would read it, even though I'm sure it'd be really good.
Yeah,
well, I suppose intelligent design possibly. Yeah. I'm a little bit critical of intelligent design in terms of its pretensions to be scientific. So, which is what my dissertation was on. So even less people would probably read it.
Yeah, you were right, by the way. You did it. I remember you did a debate with Jonathan McClatchy, who's a Christian apologist. That was really interesting.
Yeah.
Was that a public YouTube debate, or was that before everything was on YouTube?
No, it's at the London Unbelievable meetup.
Okay, nice. So you've moved from computer science into writing quite a lot of published journals about abortion while doing your PhD. Just before we go into the sort of newer areas that many of us may not have heard of, who aren't on the forefront of this conversation, what are some of the things that you see happening in the church and sort of Christian world at the moment where engagement is either lacking or sort of not headed in the right direction from what you can see? What are the common sort of pitfalls that Christians are falling into around abortion conversations?
Well, from my part, I think we spend way too much time talking about other topics, other issues that get us upset that are happening in the current culture, and not enough time talking about abortion. I mean, let me just clarify what I mean by that. I mean, there are a lot of groups talking about abortion, but I mean, within the church itself, we don't hear people talk about abortion from the pulpit very often. So while there are dedicated groups of pro-life organizations doing all kinds of really great things and trying to raise awareness, in the church itself, I don't think we talk about it enough. We don't address it. We don't hear it preached. I don't know. Have you guys ever heard someone talk about abortion from the pulpit?
Not too much. Very occasionally, there's a very high wariness of talking about abortion with the realization that there's some really high statistic and likelihood of a number of women within the congregation having had an abortion.
That is true.
Yeah, so it's trying to navigate sensitivity. So I was just distracted that Dan's gone totally out of focus. I'm not quite sure what's gone on there. So it's navigating sensitivity with the need to talk clearly about what we think of human life and where it starts. And so I'd say no, I don't hear very much about abortion at all from pulpit.
I actually preached on it about a year ago at a friend's church, not not far away, which was interesting. And you're right. I mean, after I preached, a woman came up to me and told me about her abortion, and she was very pleased to hear the message. I think obviously it's something you have to be incredibly sensitive talking about. And I think, as like it or not, as a male, you don't have the experience of pregnancy and all those kind of things. You don't carry the burden of pregnancy, and that's something you always have to take into account as well. But I don't think it means men can't speak out on abortion, because they're affected by it as well.
And that's definitely one of the bits that's not talked about at all within society, is the impact that abortion has on the men. Generally, anything that talks about a man and abortion is the man forcing the woman to have one, or generally they're just not around. But the actual side of the impact of negative emotional impact on men isn't talked about at all. I don't think I've ever heard or seen an article on that side of things.
No, that's true. And also, miscarriage as well. We hear quite a lot, rightly so, that miscarriage does have an effect on women, but it has an effect on men as well. So if a couple has a miscarriage, the man has lost a daughter or a son as well. So we don't tend to talk about that very much either.
I guess that for me highlights the conversation around miscarriage was quite interesting. There was a fairly big push recently, maybe last year. Someone who was famous had a miscarriage and decided to talk about it, and there was quite a lot of conversation about miscarriage for a period of time, and it just highlighted to me the sort of inconsistency within society that I was very aware of when my wife was pregnant, was that the will of the parent decides whether or not it's a baby in our current society. That if it's wanted, then it's a child, and we talk to it, and it's got you care for it. I mean, you people want to touch the belly. Like there's something about pregnancy that is clearly the reaction is, this is something that we want to care about, care for. It's living, it's human, it's if we lose it, it's devastating. But then on the flip side, in the same culture and society, we're talking about it's a pregnancy, not a human. It's a woman's choice. It's a woman's body, when it's scientifically not. And you've got all this sort of inconsistency that's like, I still haven't quite figured out how to navigate that with empathy, because it's quite mind-bogglingly obvious in my mind, and if I state things that I think are obvious, I usually come across as very insensitive. So it's trying to work out how to highlight that oddity within society without coming across like a jerk.
A philosopher called David Boonen talks about that in his very well-known book, A Defense of Abortion. I can't remember whether it's at the beginning or the end, and I'll have to paraphrase it. But it says, as I write this book, I look at my 8-year-old son sitting there who I love, or something like that, and in the full knowledge that the arguments I'm expounding in this book mean I could have killed him before he was born. And it's just there. He writes it, and he knows what it means, that he's providing a case for abortion, that he could have killed his own son, and it's quite confronting. And I think he's sort of expressing the view that it actually was a bit confronting to him, but he's going to go where the arguments go.
He also has like an in utero picture as well, doesn't he? I think on his desk, like he had a pic. Didn't he also have a? I'm pretty sure he had like a sonographer photo saying, at this point you could have killed it, and then, but later on.
I do wonder what his son would think about that reading the book. you know, oh wow, thanks Dad for letting me live. I think
Yeah.
it's I still find it, the whole idea is very, very strange, really.
Yeah, it's just sort of like you were saying, Phil, you know, if I decide you matter, if I decide you have value, then I'm going to do everything I can to ensure you survive, and you're welcomed into this world. But if I decide you don't matter, and you don't have any value to me, and you're disposable, then then it's all. I think psychologists talk about something called motivated reasoning, where people talk about reason as being this neutral, rational way to come to conclusions. But actually, when it's often motivated by desires, things that we want. If you so you end up approaching, if you don't want the baby because you feel that it's going to be obstructive to certain life goals and things like that, that can't help but affect how you reason about abortion, about prenatal life. No one's neutral.
It is interesting that cognitive science does tell us that we tend to attribute value as persons to, there's certain characteristics of objects. So if, for example, something has self-propelled movement, then we attribute agency to it, and that has value. If something doesn't have self-propelled movement, we find it hard, in our minds don't signal to us that it's alive, really, or that it's alive and sentient. So because embryos and early fetuses can't move of their own accord, then our cognitive apparatus tells us, our intuitions about them tell us it's not really worth that much, and that helps us to dehumanize early developing human beings.
That's really interesting, because I know it would probably have an impact on how we view people with disabilities in general outside. Is that where that's come from? Is a view of how we often dehumanize those with disabilities that make the people immobile?
I don't know where that research has come from. No, I'm sorry.
No, I've not come across that before, but I guess it kind of makes sense. So I guess just to sort of navigate the conversation, because pro-life is a huge issue, especially when it comes to abortion, and that's kind of what we're discussing. But I'd be interested, what kind of, how broad have you been publishing on? Have you been focusing on specific issues within the abortion conversation, or have you been sort of
pretty in terms of what Dan and I have been publishing? It's been quite broad in some ways. We've published a couple of papers, or this paper that will be published is on ectogenesis, artificial wombs. We've written about just, I guess, general abortion arguments, quite a bit on conscientious objection, which is whether medical staff have the right to object to being involved in provision of abortions. If it's happening in the hospital they work in, do they have to, as part of their job, be involved in providing for that abortion? So that's a really important area, because that sort of ventures into what our laws should say about our work rights and freedoms. What else have we been writing about, Dan? Embryo experimentation, the 14-day rule. There's a law that says when you have basically embryos in vitro and experimenting on them, where scientists are allowed to do that up to 14 days, and people want to extend that to 28 days, mainly because you can actually now cultivate embryos in a test tube up to 14 or 16 days. So we've been writing about that.
Personal identity. You've done quite a lot on personal identity.
Yeah, personal identity, what it means to be us. Are we just a psychological being, or are we mind and body together? One of the, I mean, that sounds a bit esoteric, but one of the main arguments in the pro-choice philosophy is that we don't really exist until we have a psychological self, and so before then, we can kill fetuses that aren't conscious or that have minimal consciousness, because they're not persons. They in fact, before you have psychological connections in your brain, before your brain is fully developed, you literally do not exist. And so aborting a fetus is not ending anyone's life. It's a pre-person that a person one day will inhabit that body, but right now they're not there, and so you're not harming them. And so that kind of sounds bizarre, but that's one of the main reasons why philosophers think abortion is permissible.
And it would make sense to say something like, my body existed, and then I came later on, rather than seeing yourself as this sort of psychosomatic unity. Instead, you are, your body can exist, and then later the real you enters into it, as those psychological connections are.
That seems to me to be extraordinarily difficult to prove from a scientific standpoint. So I guess some of my fascination with this is you guys are dealing with the scholarly side of things. How does someone argue that? Is this a philosophical argument that's then gone into mainstream, and there is no body of evidence or science to back it up? Or
it's a philosophical argument, and it's based on our intuitions, our philosophical intuitions about various things. There's someone called Jeff McMahon has written a book on this that is very comprehensive, and he makes his argument for why that view of who we really are is better than the alternative views.
But that doesn't sound very
philosophical argument behind it.
It doesn't feel intuitive to me to intuit that your body isn't you. Maybe that's just partly because I'm my own worldview that I'm now ingrained into, but
they wouldn't necessarily say that, but that is something that follows from what they're saying, because and it's a philosophical conclusion that's also informed by science as well, because actually it is true that those psychological connections do not come till much later, during fetal development. But what's whether you can derive that actually it's this, what they're arguing is those psychological connections are what matter, what make you matter. That's the philosophical argument, because they're right in the sense that those psychological connections do not develop too much later, because you start from a single cell embryo, a zygote, and it takes time for neurological development to occur and to mature. And in fact, even once you're born, they're still developing. Men until your mid-20s, your frontal lobe isn't fully developed.
And in fact, that's another thing that Dan and I, together with another colleague, friend, Callum Miller, have written about is infanticide, which is killing a child soon after it's born. And one of the implications of this psychological view is that, well, infants actually don't have very many psychological connections either, and they really don't have a sense of self. They're not self-aware until maybe they're 18 months old, and so they don't actually meet the criteria either of being what's called a person, someone of full moral worth, the same as an adult. And so the implication of these views is that infanticide actually is permissible. I mean, then maybe we can think of reasons why we shouldn't, because, it's,
you can see them.
It's a bit yucky. I mean, but in terms of following the logic of that argument, it actually is something that's permissible. And so, and these, I mean, that's well known in the literature. There's a very famous paper about partial birth abortion, saying that infanticide is not really any different. So,
well, it's the difference of a birth canal, isn't it? There's not really exactly a huge amount in it. I mean, so is person sort of synonymous with with viability? Is that kind of
no? I mean, viability is, well, Dan can maybe expand on this more. I mean, viability when a fetus can survive outside the womb, I think, is more of a convenient marker for deciding. A lot of countries have implemented laws about abortion saying you can abort before viability, sort of trying to draw a distinction between that and after viability. I guess there is a distinction somewhere, but that mark is moving all the time, depending on technology and even what country you live in and the medical services available. So I think viability is a little bit of a red herring.
Well, very much so. Yeah, I think that's really important that the Western medicine has changed what viability means in comparison to other places. And
which kind of pulls us back into the whole artificial womb topic that we were planning to talk about, because an artificial womb, as Dan and I have written about it in this paper that we're referring to, that'll be published in Christian Bioethics, it pushes back viability, because initially the development of what's called ectogenesis, or artificial womb technology is probably the more correct term. Dan will tell me. Ectogestation. It's going to come from developing neonatal care, improving it, and so when babies are born prematurely, they'll be able to go in an artificial womb and have much better health outcomes. Babies that do survive before 24 weeks, which is kind of, I think, the viability point, roughly, more or less, they don't have a very good chance of developing completely normally. You know, their lungs are incredibly undeveloped and everything else, and their outcomes are not really very good. So artificial womb technology has, the promise of, if you can exactly replicate a womb, then if you can, when the child's born prematurely, if you can immediately transfer them into that artificial womb, then hopefully the process will just continue roughly as normal, and they won't suffer all these adverse outcomes, which will affect them the rest of their life.
So just before we move into the sort of ethics around that, like, just to dig a bit deeper, how close to having artificial wombs are we? Are they in existence? Are they being developed as we speak? Like, what stage are we discussing this? Or is this ahead of the curve type ethical argument?
Do you want to answer that, Dan?
Yeah, I can tell. So there's always a bit of the planning fallacy when it comes to this. People always think that things they'll be there. We have these ideas, but we think they'll be there much sooner than they actually are. So in reality, like, no one can give you a concrete answer about when we're going to be seeing some kind of artificial womb. But what we do know is that there are certain kinds of technology that have been tested on lambs. I call it a biobag. There's an article published in 2017 in the journal Nature that where they basically they put young lamb fetuses into this biobag, which is effectively a kind of artificial womb, and they developed that lamb for I think it was about 28 days. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce. I think it was about 28 days.
That's right. Yeah.
And it developed healthily. There were no obvious sort of neurodevelopmental issues. I mean, there were certainly limitations to what they could test for, but it didn't seem, it seemed feasible. So that's, it's at least feasible. I think whether the technology that they used whether that could be utilized in humans we don't know, but they're mammals like us. The anatomy and physiology is relatively similar, but we don't know. But there's a lot of research. So at the University of Eindhoven in Holland, there's a lot of, I think they've recently won a couple of million to look into the development of artificial wombs. And there's a couple of other companies, private companies as well, that are raising money to look at this as well. It's certainly in the purview of potentially the next few decades. But again, no one really knows when, but we do know that actually it's probably inevitable, which is why me and Bruce try and talk and think a bit about it from a Christian perspective, because what tends to happen, Christians are largely behind the curve. And so what we do, we wait till something new comes out on the horizon, ethically, scientifically, etc., that's going to impact, that's going to have an effect on us. And then suddenly we start addressing it. And I think what me and Bruce are trying to do, and we're not the only people that have looked at the ethics of artificial wombs from a Christian perspective. But what we're trying to do is anticipate things. Is right. This is looking like it's on the horizon in the next few decades. Let's actually look at what Christians just think about it, and what are their theological implications to it? What are the ethical implications? We want to try and be ahead of the curve. So just add a bit of context quickly. Is there are different kinds of artificial wombs. So most people, when you say an artificial womb, people start thinking about the Matrix. Don't you? We've all seen the scene in the Matrix where he hatches out on the robots, and that's how human beings are created and developed. Or people think about Aldous Huxley's book, A Brave New World, where humans are created and developed in hatcheries and things like that. That's ectogenesis. So ecto is outside, external, outside. Genesis is origins. So ectogenesis is external origins, and that's where you'd have an embryo that would be created via probably IVF, and then it will put into some sort of artificial environment, an artificial womb, where it develop until it's been fully gestated. Ectogestation is what Bruce was talking about. Is where maybe you have we use the example, Bruce gives the example of a woman, say at 19 weeks, might have some sort of aggressive uterine cancer. And so she has to choose between, do I carry this child to term or near term and risk the cancer spreading and not being around for her baby? Or could it be transferred into some kind of artificial womb, irrespective of the technology that's going to be, that might involve, so that she can get the treatment she wants and the child can therefore be externally gestated until it's safe for them to be born, even though we'd argue in a sense they have been born. So they're the two kinds, and I think ectogestation is the one that's much more likely to be developed. I think because, as Bruce was saying, it's kind of an extension of existing neonatal care, or that's at least how we would view it, compared to something developing a human embryo and fetus all the way to term from a single cell embryo is going to be, I think that's, I can't see that happening this century, but I might be wrong. Who knows?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the full ectogenesis is not likely to happen for a long time, but there's certainly a lot of demand for ectogestation. I think better neonatal care. I mean, really, really common thing in pregnancy is preeclampsia, and the only way that, well, I'm not a medical doctor, but the only way I know of to treat preeclampsia is delivering the child, and other than rest in hospital and things like that. But severe cases of preeclampsia, if you really have to just have a delivery, and unless the child is developed to beyond 24 weeks or maybe a bit later, the child is going to die. And even if the child does survive, they're going to have a lot of adverse outcomes. And so preeclampsia is incredibly common. If ectogestation technologies are able to deal with that, it will make a really significant difference. So Dan's right. That's where the advances are going to come for the foreseeable future.
So we're talking about quite a positive reason for having these artificial wombs is to support women in very difficult scenarios where it's their life or a child's, and in scenarios where they would be considering, as we've just discussed, that it's a child that they want to keep. So it's not like, I guess abortion doesn't really come into this in the same way, though it could, as I think, if I'm hearing you right, it could impact the abortion arguments in terms of viability, that kind of would remove some of that argument that the child, it's no longer about viability. If you can put them into an artificial womb, you're no longer forcing a woman to have a child.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the most famous arguments for allowing women to have an abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson, she explicitly says in this philosophical paper that's probably one of the most cited papers in history, she explicitly says her argument for allowing abortion is not an argument for the death of the fetus. It's an argument for taking an unwanted fetus out of a woman. It's not to kill it. And so this being able to preserve the child's life once it's removed is has quite an impact on her argument. I think both Dan and I have become skeptics that it'll actually make that much difference to abortion. Where, as a society, we're pretty good at post hoc justification of what we want to do, and so there'll be plenty of reasons why. Well, maybe viability is not as important as we thought, or I think maybe we're going to do what society wants to do anyway. But it will certainly make it harder to justify having an abortion if the child, at the stage you're talking about a later term abortion, it can be removed and put into an artificial womb. But even now, we do see laws that allow babies to be aborted up to just before birth.
Oh yeah.
I mean, they're clearly viable.
Yeah.
If you can abort a baby at 35 weeks, then there's no question of viability there. And in some jurisdictions, you're allowed to do that right now. So that kind
especially if disability is involved, then and even the most tame. That's
right, and that's a really interesting area. There are arguments, philosophical arguments about why you should be able to abort children with disabilities, and a lot of disability groups will say, well, we feel as though that doesn't value us very highly, and much less than any other human beings. And it's a bit hard to escape that conclusion that
it's impossible to. Well, I think it's impossible. Maybe I'm overstating my case from a non-scholarly view, but if you're dehumanizing disability in the womb, then it dehumanizes everyone that's alive. I don't think you can escape that. Though we celebrate when they do well and they're inspiring in Paralympics, we'll still weed them out through technology in the womb. We don't really want. That's the kind of how else can you? What other conclusions can be made when we're specifically developing technology to find disabilities in the womb, so we can remove said fetus with said disability? The
Paralympians who have been that way since birth, they're the survivors.
Yeah,
and they're probably a minority nowadays.
Especially with things.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Imagine we changed disability to women or to girls, and we said, look, the limit is 24 weeks for male fetuses, but for female fetuses, it's right up to birth. It's not that we, once they're born, it's not that there's nothing against them. It's just that we feel, that once you're out of the room, we'll celebrate you. But once you're in, while you're in there, it's going to be. But it's not based on discrimination or prejudice or
of course
or anything at all. It's just that's just the rules of the game.
Yeah,
I've actually written a paper on this about genetic selective abortion, and basically my argument in that paper is, if you agree that you can select for disability, then the logic follows that you can select for sex.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you can select for any genetic trait you like. And I give an example of there are 4 genes that we can identify thus far that indicate a higher chance of engaging in same-sex behavior when you are an adult. It's just a disposition. You have a maybe 25% higher chance of basically having same-sex relationships when you're an adult. And so, in theory, if you can test for those genes while you are in the womb, then some parents might decide, well, I don't want a child like that, and I'll abort them.
Wow.
There's all kinds of genetic kind of testing you can do for that. And more common one, what about intelligence? Just say, your family isn't one with a great academic record, but you really want your kids to get into university. Well, if your child has the genes that indicate they're going to have, they're not as academically capable as they might have been, then you could try again another time.
Just to be clear, you do disagree with this.
Yeah, if you've just joined us, this isn't a pro.
No, this was an argument I wrote basically saying if you accept abortion for disability, it logically commits you to accepting abortion for all kinds of genetic traits, criminality or goodness or whatever. I mean, it's, research in these areas of what gene combinations affect our behavior is ongoing and immense, really. So again, these are only dispositions. Our genes don't determine our destiny, but they certainly influence it.
Well, it's even been shown that down to the side of things with the Down syndrome tests haven't exactly been exact either. You hear these different stories of people who've been said to be highly likely to have Down syndrome from the tests, and then they come out and they don't, and at one point they could well have been aborted. And I don't know how likely, because that test has changed recently to be more accurate, so maybe that's old.
Yeah, well, there's 2 types of tests out there. I think from
invasive.
If you have a scan, they'll do all kinds of measurements to try and determine whether your child might have Down syndrome. But if you actually have a genetic test, I think that's extremely accurate. But previously, I'm not sure what it is now, but the genetic test itself involved the possibility that you would lose the child. Right. And so that's if you want to take that risk to determine whether your child has Down syndrome, that's what you have to do.
Yeah,
like 1%. 1%.
Yeah, which that's when you look at your own children, would you want a 1% chance that you could lose them over something? That seems pretty high to me. It raises the case of Iceland. I think that Iceland is a country that's almost completely eliminated Down syndrome. I think there's less, it's single digits the number of Down syndrome children born in Iceland. And Iceland doesn't have a huge population either, but the number of Down syndrome children born is almost zero.
Yeah.
Well, it's the fact that it's viewed as a success as well.
Yeah, it's horrendous. I find all the sort of severe disabilities, just when you meet a kid with Down syndrome or a person, adult with Down syndrome, like I don't get it. I don't get why that's a disability that we want out of society. There are obviously health implications, and there's added complications with raising someone who has Down syndrome as a disability, but they're beautiful people. I just don't understand it.
Well, I mean, the world is probably, the world would probably be much better off with more Down syndrome people and probably, less of people who are extremely intelligent and who, you know, cause
Find ways to
harm.
justify it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, yeah, it depends on what your value of human beings is. And most of us think human beings are valuable if they can be economically productive. Probably a hangover from a time when if you weren't economically productive, you died because there just wasn't the resources to look after you. But certainly in Western countries where we're wealthy enough to do that, and it really shows what we think of disability when we allow them to be killed before they're born.
It is weird because thinking about that, I mean, there obviously were times in history where someone with Down syndrome, a person born with Down syndrome, would be. This is in no way to devalue them as individuals, but a burden, in the sense that, if you were trying to, at certain times in history, if you couldn't work, like you said, if you couldn't work, you couldn't contribute to the life of the family. You would be a burden. It does seem very much like a carryover from having that mindset in which it's. I'm not saying that would be a reason not to do it, but it's like we're looking back in history thinking those people are a burden, they can't contribute to society. But actually, nowadays a lot of people with Down syndrome can contribute.
They do, and do more so than many who don't have any or disability. And it's a mess of the society we live in, and it's where my empathy for that kind of thinking. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I've got in trouble in the past of being overly strong on my social media about, partly because where we're headed, my daughter shouldn't be born with the sort of severe condition that she has. And so it can get quite personal quite quickly, so I get quite defensive. But also
understandably so.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I know that I'm fully justified in some of the responses that I have, but there's also, I understand that the implications for a parent working that through and working that out are incredibly tough. But man, to see this life as something that can just be discarded because it makes mine uncomfortable, there's this attitude towards children that they're a commodity now that I just I think even within the Christian church, there's this sort of attitude that I expect certain things of my life and that show that God blesses me, and that one of them is I should get married. The next is I should have kids. And so how we talk about this in the church is it's very much that's the expectation. And when that doesn't happen, well, I should have kids and I'm going to make it happen. And I don't think that's talked about too much. And I've friends and family that have gone through IVF, but I don't recall ever hearing anything about the implications of IVF. And there's a lot of Christian couples who think about it incredibly hard and have gone through all the ethics of that and made sure they don't have too many embryos, made sure that they've done it very carefully. But there's still a underlying assumption around children, I think, that we have a right to have them, and B, that they're sort of like I can have the ones that make my life better. And that attitude there's an edge to it within the church, but in society it's I will have them when I want because I can control my life. It kind of adds as a background to all this sort of stuff about choice. Just makes it even more messy.
Well, ectogenesis will really allow you to have them whenever you like, if that becomes a reality, because it will remove gestation away from the human experience if you have enough money to pay for it. Whenever it actually becomes a reality, means you can, use IVF and straight into an artificial womb, and you can have your child without any involvement with your own body whatsoever,
Wow.
except at the very, very beginning.
Which there are times when that, yeah. So I guess let's sort of discuss the ethics of that then. So just sort of processing that. So there's some conversation around surrogacy and the sort of so when that the artificial womb would remove the need for a surrogate. So I guess that kind of ethical dilemma would be removed. But for those who have significant health issues that can't carry to term but would love to have children with their partner, then the artificial womb could enable that. As an ethical scenario, would that be a...
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a possibility.
What would a Christian response be to that? Is that wrong to go through that, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a close Christian friend who has been in that situation where she's unable to have her own children because of a particular condition, and used a surrogate to have a child, a close relative, and yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's probably, in terms of ectogenesis, it's better to step back from that and say, okay, maybe it will help eliminate surrogacy, which would be a good thing, because paid for surrogacy, I think, is very is exploitative of women, and it's mainly poorer women in developing countries who do it for rich women in other countries, and I don't think that's a really good thing at all, because it extracts quite a high price from them, despite being compensated. But there's the issue. One of the issues with full ectogenesis is the effect that it would have on a child, and how we get from here to there without doing a lot of experimentation. And that's a real worry. What about the children who we're going to put through the process of seeing whether this thing works, developing the technology, finding the flaws, all that kind of thing? There's a lot of ethical dilemmas involved there to start with, apart from the effects of ectogenesis. Once it's perfected, the process of getting there might sacrifice a lot of lives and have some implications we don't expect.
I mean, you can imagine how I can imagine in a horrible way they would go about doing, in the sense of, there are millions of spare embryos left over from IVF. I think just in the United States. So you can imagine a scenario where they were able to get permission to utilize a spare embryo, and testing it and say, right, well, abortion is legal, say even somewhere 6 weeks. Well, we're going to develop the embryo for 6 weeks, and then we'll abort it at switch off artificial gestation at six weeks. Great, right? Let's and then you basically build it up until you get, and you just look at you would tweak things as as required. And you can imagine a scenario like that where it starts off, just say, right, let's get to a week, right, abort. Let's get to 2 weeks, right, let's end it. Let's get to 3 weeks, and you would build it up. I can imagine some sort of scenario like that.
Good.
Yeah, I think Dan's absolutely right that it's almost inevitable that these millions of spare embryos, some of them who aren't owned by anyone, I expect, will end up getting used for experiments for ectogenesis. That seems, in hindsight, that seems pretty obvious that that's what will happen. A lot of those embryos have been donated for scientific research already. And so you have millions of human beings at the earliest stage of their life who will get used and then discarded after a certain period of time. And I think personally, I think that's horrendous.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, again, it's something that's sort of there, and we don't tend to think about. And I guess there's a comment from Callum in the chat, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if you've read David Albert Jones. Have you come across Soul of the Embryo? Have you come across that? So I guess maybe taking a step back, we're kind of assuming pro-life stance in our conversations that the embryo has life, value, is human. Where would you argue, especially in a scholarly way, but maybe bring it down to my level, like why is that Christian? And for anyone who might catch on to why is pro-life such a big thing for the Christian, when the embryo, as we've already said, it isn't viable, especially in the early weeks. The earliest weeks, especially these embryos that are in storage, don't have a heartbeat, don't have a brain. Why is there value in them, and why can't they be discarded?
Well, that's a good question. Probably Dan and I both should try and answer this. From a Christian point of view, well, I mean, there isn't really. I mean, the Bible doesn't really directly address abortion, but there are quite a lot of passages in the Bible that indicate God values us before we're born. I think it must be Psalm 139 talks about how God knits us together in our mother's womb, and so there's a very real sense that God is intimately involved in the process of our creation before we're born. And so I think that's a very strong indication that certainly from God's point of view, we're valuable before we're born. I think John the Baptist's mother, it describes how John the Baptist had the Holy Spirit before he was even born. So again, from a theological point of view, I think any entity that can have the Holy Spirit, it probably better indicates you probably should be killing them. Yeah, Dan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, in the New Testament, you see the same word for a born child is used for unborn, Greek term brephos. So there's the biblical writers did not understand any distinction between prenatal and postnatal human beings. I think you can derive from that as well, that Jesus was an embryo, Jesus was a fetus, and if Jesus would killed, in utero, it would have been, you'd be killing the Savior. So we have to think that there are causal. What happens in utero affects what happens afterwards. Bruce has talked a lot about. It was written a lot about this, and I also think it's key as well. Is when we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. When we look at pregnancy and fetal life, is in that context, what does it mean for a Christian? Jesus, to love our neighbours, and there are a few options, and I think a pro-abortion or a pro-choice stance, it is hard to take that reading exegetically or to understand. When Jesus says, "Go and do likewise," when we look at fetal life and pregnancy, and we take that parable seriously, even consider how to do likewise, it's very hard to come away, I think, from looking at prenatal life and think that loving our neighbour means killing them in utero before they can be born and flourish and flourish to the glory of God. So I think any Christian has to take that seriously, and they have to be able to I would struggle, at judgment, stand before God and say, no, I understand, that actually I understood a good interpretation of loving my neighbour as myself, and would entails that abortion is permissible. I find that unpalatable. in the same way that if a Christian said infanticide was okay. That's.
If I might add to that as well, just in terms of reasons, I think for 2,000 years, the Christian church has been opposed to abortion, where the church has been very consistent about that. From the very early days, Christians rescued children that were exposed for which was the Roman practice of children they didn't want. They would just leave them out for the wild beasts, and they would eventually die or be eaten. And Christians were known for rescuing those children. And I think there's very early Christian writings indicate that they thought abortion wasn't permissible. And the church has been very consistent in that stance for all of that time. We're now Protestant and Catholic, and I think the Catholic Church has been probably the most consistent. But over the 2,000 years, Christians have been opposed to abortion, and it's something church tradition, while it's not inviolable, is something we need to take into consideration. Why did the church fathers think that, and what's changed that we think we can do that now? And I don't think anything has.
Human development hasn't changed at all since then.
Well, I guess I meant our knowledge of human development.
Just to reinforce what Bruce is saying as well. This potentially goes back to the first century as well. If we looking at the D-Decay, quite clearly says that abortion is murder. You've got the Gospel of Barnabas as well. That's probably early second Epistle of Barnabas, early 2nd century. You look at the church fathers like Tertullian, and it's absolutely consistent for the first few, very clearly for the first few hundred years. And I think a Christian has to you have to take those views seriously and wonder how they why did they have those views, why were they so strong and prevalent. And you saw those views amongst that come straight out of Judaism as well. What's the most valuable thing is your family, the importance of children and having a family, and so that the very thought of killing an unborn child in utero is really anathema to Jewish culture, because they just so clearly understood that all human beings bear the image of God.
That's really helpful. I think that brings a decent amount of clarity to the assumptions that we've brought to this conversation. So I think that's good. I guess the one sort of point of clarity, I'd be interested in your views on this. I don't think we've talked about it before on this channel. So the most common thing at the moment that I'm seeing online with regards to the idea that even in extreme cases where it's usually rape and incest are the two cases that are brought up as examples, you've got this common, I've never seen it, but you've seen the costumes of like the Handmaid's Tale. That's the result of men telling women that they can't, even in these extreme cases, have abortions. That you're basically making women into baby factories. What I think is, I'll put my cards on the table. I think it's an absurd argument, but I can't put words around why.
all the survey data from the US and I think from the UK shows that men are more pro-choice than women.
Yeah, no, that's right. By far, the majority of people who I guess they're often called pro-life are women rather than men. I think abortion probably suits men more than it does women a lot of the time. It's very convenient for men to escape their responsibilities by the woman that they've enabled to have a child ends that pregnancy, they can escape complete responsibility for it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so,
Largely, men want abortion. They want legal abortion. Largely.
That's really interesting. So that's really interesting. I think I'd come across that, but I'd not connected the dots in that as a response. Like, actually, if you want a society controlled by men, you're in it. Like, be pro-life and you'll fight that.
It's rhetorically powerful. Like, the reason you hear it so often is because it's classic rhetoric. On the surface, it's a good point to make. There are bodies. Men should play show no part in telling us what we can and can't do with our bodies. So there is a level in which it seems intuitive until you poke a little bit further. You have to neglect that a significant proportion of all women, probably around the world, are not pro-choice, and certainly nowhere near as pro-choice, as permissive as women in the West.
I think another, I guess, relevant point, particularly in the US, is the Roe versus Wade case is of immense importance in the United States in allowing abortion to become legal. And sometimes people who make the accusation you mentioned conveniently forget that that decision was made by seven men in the Supreme Court. And so men are the ones who enabled abortion to become legal in that country. And now that there's a woman on the Supreme Court who is pro-life, apparently that's not so good. So I'm not sure that argument holds at all when it comes to the Supreme Court of the United States.
It was just the right men were in there before, and now
the right men were in there.
Yeah, now she's just caught up in the patriarchy.
Yeah, and
I've been on Twitter too much.
She's an example of I can't remember. I think she's got like maybe 7 children or something like that.
Yeah, she's Catholic,
she's a Catholic, and apparently women can have children and rise to the office of the Supreme Court all at once.
Yeah. What a testimony of the sort of anti-rhetoric that we're.
I think they've adopted children as well, haven't they? I think they've got like several of their own, but they've also adopted as well.
She is a superwoman, as far as I can tell.
She is.
She kind of is an illustration of how that. I think sometimes women are patronized by saying, "Well, you need to get rid of your child so that you can get your education or you can make this achievement," and so on. Well, maybe that's not true, and if it is true, maybe society needs a little bit of reordering so that we don't have to sacrifice children for our education and our careers prospects.
Yeah,
I think the French Prime Minister said something like that, maybe within the last year, maybe it's a little longer about, and basically said, that women can't have lots of children and be successful. And there's a great Twitter thread of just all these probably mostly Catholic women with like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, absolutely flourishing, with PhDs in top jobs, but it just went on forever. I couldn't even get to the bottom because there were just so many.
Amazing.
Although, saying that again, I still do think we have to recognize as things stand, actually, it will be more difficult, especially if you're a single parent, thinking, you can go and carry on your education and there won't be obstructions and challenges of that. Of course there will be, but it's not necessarily the inevitable, as inevitably negative as it's often framed, which I think you're right to say that the women are often patronized by that.
Having said that, I think society does need to have some changes so that women, particularly single women who do have children, it is easier for them. And I think we're actually seeing that in terms of there's it's easier in most countries to have longer periods of maternity leave, time off to raise children, and I think that's a really good trend that does help us value children more.
Yeah, I think it's also shifting that. Well, at least in my generation, I think I'm seeing more men, especially in the church, accommodating the progress and careers of their wives. I think I know of a handful of people of blokes who have taken on, at least for a period of time, looking after the kids and taking more of a not backseat, but just taking the role of parent while the other works, and that's definitely more acceptable these days than I know that it was. I mean, there's probably a lot of people that would decry that as the feminization of Christianity, but I see it as a good move where dads take ownership of the role and responsibility that God's given them, and if that means they have to stay at home for a bit, well, be a man about it.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, I mean, I think in retrospect, you get to whatever age you retire at, and it's like, well, did it really matter that I worked for 42 years instead of 43 years? Or, you know what I mean? It's like, we spend most of our lives working. Is it such a bad thing for men too to spend more time with their children and just a year less or whatever it might be from their career? Most of us peak in our careers at a certain time in midlife anyway, and I don't know, work is maybe not quite as important as we think it is sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge to be had. So I think we've gone around different routes. I guess before we sort of begin to wrap this up, it'd be interesting to talk about the more negative implications around the ethics of, because especially about artificial wombs. We kind of went into artificial wombs, heard the positives, potentially the way that it negates the argument of viability. We've talked about it potentially in natal care really helping when then it's the life of the mum or the life of the baby. Where are the negatives or the ethical implications that Christians should be aware of, and possibly starting to think of how we might respond, and do there need to be barriers on this?
Well, I guess, I mean, going back to the paper that Dan and I've written, it's probably, it'll probably be 12 months before it's out, I think, but that'll be good. I think from our point of view anyway, it's it's a readable paper, and it will be worth reading if you're interested in this kind of technology when it does come out in the journal called Christian Bioethics. You won't need to be a philosopher to read it, I don't think so. Anyone
stuff as a preprint anyway, isn't it? We could always put a link in here. We've got a pre.
Yeah, that's right.
Put a link in the description. Okay.
So one thing we've mentioned is the whole process of getting to ectogenesis involves experimentation, and that's obviously there's a lot of negatives involved with that, and possible use of frozen embryos and that kind of thing. IVF itself will be necessary, and IVF, there are a lot of ethical complications with IVF, mainly to do, I think, with surplus embryos. But for Roman Catholics, think IVF separates sex from having children, and they think it is kind of a disordering of human relationships. So that's for people who are Catholics. I don't really hold to that myself, but anything a Catholic philosopher says, I do take seriously their point of view, because they're normally very thoughtful and very thorough in their ruminations. I think Dan and I have highlighted in this paper as well that if we ever do get to the position where it's kind of ubiquitous that people use artificial wombs, this is incredibly speculative, because I kind of doubt that will happen. But we might get to the Matrix eventually. Just as an aside, I did read the other day that most people under 30 have never even seen one of the Matrix movies, so they may not understand what we're even talking about there. But
the Matrix 4 trailer came out the other day, so
the Matrix 4 trailer just came out, so they might have to go back and watch them.
Binge watch Matrix.
But there is, in Christianity, there's a really deep theological significance to conception, pregnancy, and birth. And I mean, the central fact, I guess, of the founding fact of Christianity is the incarnation, where Jesus came and was somehow conceived and through a virgin birth and was born. And in time, if that is entirely removed from human experience, we just note that may detract from the theological significance of the incarnation. And generally, it's also used, birth as a metaphor for the new birth in becoming a Christian. And so these metaphors and these events, their theological significance in the distant future, if ectogenesis becomes ubiquitous, we may start to lose touch with what they mean. We may think they're less significant than what they are today. So that's one.
That's really interesting.
I think we noted a few other things. I mean, we identified that there was one of the problems was that ectogestation seems largely very positive. I don't think any Christian, I can't. There are very few. I don't think there are no persuasive reasons really, I think, for not embracing ectogestation, which, as we discussed, is really just an extension of existing neonatal care. Because in that case, I don't think there would be much experimentation in the same way we talk about ectogenesis. It would be, look, here is this scenario. This baby is going to die, perhaps anyway. Let's see if we can, let's see if we can save them by transferring them to an artificial womb, which is very different to the scenario we're talking about in terms of ectogenesis.
Yeah.
I think what me and Bruce point out is once you've gone down the road of accepting ectogestation, in many ways you've then enabled ectogenesis, because all that's going to happen is you're going to push back ectogestation further and further as time passes. Once it might be 20 weeks, now it's 18 weeks. Now you can transfer a fetus at 14 weeks, at 12, and it keeps going back to the point that actually now our technology would actually enable us to facilitate ectogenesis. So and that has a lot more ethical problems.
So in that sense, though, the ethical issues of developing so it's like the reverse of your development. Your experimentation is more on a positive ethical line of let's try and save this child earlier and earlier and earlier at the different extremes, whereas opposed to destroying embryos in the process of trying to keep them longer. So that's quite interesting. The positive ethic of neonatal care would inadvertently create something where actually eventually IVF could go into an artificial womb, and the woman hasn't physically been involved other than producing the egg. Same with the man producing the sperm.
Yeah, I mean, it gets potentially more sinister as well, because what you could potentially see, you got to think as well. Look, this is only going to be occurring in rich Western countries. This isn't going to be happening in Sierra Leone or Kenya or Peru. It's going to be happening in the US, UK, Australia, Canada, China, Russia, etc. And what you can see happening is, well, if you're already doing IVF, you're going to be doing PGD, prenatal genetic diagnosis as well. So you're going to pick, you're going to ensure that you've got a healthy embryo to implant. Well, what's to stop you then using CRISPR, which is sort of technology to potentially change gene therapy, change the genes. You potentially end up with the logic is developing rich Western people developing enhanced embryos. Right? Well, let's use CRISPR to make them more intelligent. Let's use CRISPR to after we've chosen a healthy embryo, is to make sure they've got the genes to be tall. They're all going to be 6'3". Let's make sure they're going to be handsome or beautiful. Let's ensure that they're athletic. So it's and that's what humans do. It won't be many people. That's we're so terrible that once you open that door, there'll be someone somewhere will push it to its conclusions and do everything they can.
Other people will want it as well, and basically you end up with what's called the commodification of children, where we engineer children to be what we want. And
it's an artificial way of doing that. I mean, people have been trying to do that for. I mean, people did that with slaves. People did that with trying to make sure they're breeding the right people, and making commodities out of humans has been happening for centuries. We've just now got technology that can do it for us. So it's
part of what's ironic as well is that a lot of the arguments for it is based on sort of justice. So a lot of the feminist literature will talk about how this should be supported and enabled because it frees women from the burdens of pregnancy. But what's ironic is that 99, I think Bruce will correct me if I'm wrong, but about 99% of all of maternal mortality occurs in lower middle income countries. So we're going to implement technology to save women, comparatively rich Western women, from the burden of pregnancy, whilst 99% of maternal mortality occurs in lower middle income countries who will not be able to utilize this technology. So actually seems there's almost an argument that actually developing ectogenesis is actually unjust in many ways, because it benefits those who are already privileged to such an extent, over those comparatively less well-off women around the rest of the world.
One other downside that we don't actually mention in our paper, but probably should have now that I think about it, is that in this commodification of children, the status of children in an artificial womb is, for a lot of people will be a little bit uncertain. They're not, abortion's permissible now. So society doesn't, as a whole, a lot of people in society don't place a whole lot of value on children that are being gestated. We're short of organ donors for an enormous number of different organs. It will be incredibly easy to take, again, maybe all these frozen embryos, and we can produce so much good by gestating children in there. Maybe we can engineer it so that they don't have a brain, so they're not really alive. At least they're not fully human, and we can grow organs in our artificial wombs. And that's going to be, we humans have a history of justifying things like this because of the great good they can achieve. And I can see that is probably a very likely outcome of ectogenesis in the distant future, but certainly I can see that happening.
Lots to think about.
But
process of that.
This is why our paper in Christian Bioethics calls it the Christian dilemma. I mean, Christians traditionally, we want to look after infants and the premature, and looking after the sick is what Christians do, and that's what they've done for 2,000 years. And so we have this dilemma of seeking to do that through technology may one day enable this technology that has not so good implications. And that's why we say it is a Christian dilemma.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite an interesting way of putting it. Definitely put a link into the description. I'm starting to fade, I'll be honest.
I'm starting to feel like breakfast.
You're
it's only early
just
for
starting to
Bruce.
get to breakfast. So it'd be interesting, just as we start to close up, Bruce, and Dan, feel free to add onto this as well. What maybe give us a couple different resources. What's a sort of popular level resource that you'd recommend people just sort of starting to engage from it? What would you give to a pastor to give to a congregation? Which one?
I would give a pastor a copy of our preprint.
Yeah,
I think that's the most concise and relatively readable resource on artificial wombs for a Christian pastor could find at the moment. That would be
awesome.
If that's not too egotistical of us.
No, I don't think, because that's part of why we did it. I think even the reviewers from the journal said that this would be the perfect thing to give to pastors, college professors who are introducing it to a Christian community. So I don't think we're being egotistical. I think that's part of the reason we've written it very. You don't need any expertise, really. I like to think to read the paper and understand the main.
No,
points.
that's right. Yeah. I mean, other than that, go and see The Matrix, starting at the first one, and you could probably skip the second and third one.
Stop at the first one, really.
Yeah, stop at the first and maybe see the fourth.
Watch the first one, and then that's it.
And other book as well that covers it quite well, especially the best, probably the best book of abortion is Christopher Kazel's book on abortion, and that has a whole chapter on artificial wombs. So if you want to have something that tackles abortion and artificial wombs, then his book would be the standard book to go to.
Yeah, cool. I mean, artificial womb, if you're going to want to read up on artificial wombs, go the whole hog and get his book and get up to date on abortion in general, because I think that's, in a way, that's a far more pressing topic of moral concern than artificial wombs, even though we're talking about those now. So
yeah,
the two go together.
Just one more point as well, quickly. I know it's late now. Is that I think a lot of Christians, what you see is very positive. Put a really positive spin on the technology, the whole notion of ectogenesis, because they think it will stop abortion. They think that once we've got artificial wombs, that'll end abortion. But I think, as me and Bruce kind of argue and have done elsewhere, is I just genuinely don't think that's the case, because the logic of it is that, well, if you've got an artificial womb, well, women can already gestate and then give the child up for adoption. So, but most women who pursue abortions do not do that; they abort, and so it's very unlikely that this group of individuals is then going to suddenly decide to gestate for, say, 30 weeks or 25 weeks, and then go through something on par, on medically on par in terms of risk, the same as a cesarean section, and then give the child up for adoption. It just seems kind of implausible to me.
Or and whoever's the societal pressures that lead a woman to make that decision to abort as well will still be there.
Yeah. And it has to be available early enough to compete with abortion as well, which is not really in the purview for decades. Most abortions occur before 13 weeks, and the technology is not going to be. I can't see it being anywhere near there for decades, if ever, for a while.
Cool. It's really helpful, guys. I really appreciated your clarity and candor this evening. It's a big topic, and I've very much appreciated you guys and all the work you're doing. Even though I haven't read your papers, it's good that you're doing it, and very much appreciate all of that. And I will make sure I will read this paper that's aimed at pastors, because I'm like, well, I understand that one.
You could read the abstract.
Yeah, I'll start there. At least, I'll definitely give it a go. Make sure you send me the link. Cool. Any final comments, words, wisdom?
No, go Bruce.
No, I think basically for Christians, the more you can learn about this whole area of reproductive ethics, as it's called, the better. I mean, when you learn that there are between 50 and 75 million abortions worldwide every year, there's probably been 1 billion abortions since the turn of the century, since, you know, in the last 20 years. They're staggering numbers, and it's just something to think about in terms of our priorities in what we talk about, and even in churches, with sensitivity, as you said yourself, Phil. The likelihood is women in the congregation may have had an abortion, and it's really important to when you talk about abortion, to let people know it's not an unforgivable sin either, and that you know, people find forgiveness after abortions like they do for any other sin, but it's still something that we need to be talking about more.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, absolutely agreed, and trying to find ways to do that in my own sort of preaching and teaching. Cool. Well, thanks again. I'll sort of wrap this up. And so we've got a couple of conversations. We're starting to get ourselves organised with who to talk to. Dan's been busy today with getting a line of people to talk to. Where if you are on our Patreon support list, then we'll get a list out to our Patreons soon of all the upcoming chats, and otherwise you just have to wait till they happen. And yeah, that we can find us patreon.com, Critical Witness. We've got the one I will tell you about is we've got Dr. Joshua Swamidas next week talking about the genealogical Adam and Eve, and whether or not science says anything about Adam and Eve being a real couple in the not so distant past, and all that sort of debate about origins and Genesis in a different form than what we've been talking about tonight. So join us next Thursday evening for that. And I think that's all from us tonight. Have a very good evening. And thanks to those who have watched, and those of you watching on demand, make sure you like, subscribe, share, and comment. Let us know what you think. Have a good night. See you later.